right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome everyone again. Thank you for joining today's training on Practical Guide to Working with Refugees, Skills, Techniques, and Considerations. This webinar is part 3 in our 4-part series on case management fundamentals. If you missed the first 2 webinars in the series, Tanisha will be putting a link to the recording in the chat for you to stream at your convenience. Those recordings are also going to be available on our Switchboard library at switchboard.ta.org. This training is presented to you by Switchboard, a one-stop resource hub for refugee service providers in the United States in partnership with Center for Adjustment, Resilience, and Recovery, which you'll hear as referenced with an acronym CARE. For those of you who are not familiar with CARE, it is a project of the International Rescue Committee and the National Child Traumatic Stress Network via the very generous support of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. My name is Tigest Coleman, and I am Switchboard's Training Officer. I'm joined by my co-hosts today, Rebecca Moqueen and Tanisha Harris. You'll be hearing from both Rebecca and or Tanisha in the chat throughout today's training. I'd also like to mention that today's session will run for 1 hour and 30 minutes and that it is being recorded. You will receive an email with the recording, the slides, and recommended resources within 24 hours. The webinar transcript, along with the recording, will also be posted on the Switchboard website within the following days. All right, let's take a look at some of our settings in Zoom. All attendees are currently muted and are joined in listen-only mode. You may switch between your audio, between your computers and or phone at any time under audio settings located in the lower left of your screen. Due to the very large size of the webinar today, we've disabled the chat box as it would be moving too quickly and hard to follow. But keep an eye out on the chat for messages and links from Switchboard to various resources we'll be mentioning throughout. We'll also be activating the chat as needed. That does not mean that we don't want to hear from you. Please type your questions in the Q&A box and we'll address them during the Q&A time. You can click the thumbs up next to vote for another participant's question. We've also reviewed the questions that you submitted during the pre-registration, and we hope that we will cover most of them during the training. And we'll, of course, have time for Q&A to ask more questions. Finally, you have the option to turn on automated closed captioning on today's webinar. To do so, you can click on the CC or live transcript. You may choose subtitles or the full transcript. You also have the option to change the font size and other parameters. You may turn the closed captioning on and off at any time. Please keep in mind that closed captioning for today's webinar is automated and it may not be completely accurate. Following the webinar, we'll post a fully edited transcript to the Switchboard website, which we do for most of our audio and video materials. Well, if you've joined the first 2 series, you have heard us introduce ourselves, and we'll do just that today. Again, my name is Tigest Coleman, and I'm honored to be facilitating this training with just 2 incredibly talented, passionate individuals that you'll be hearing from shortly. I'm a licensed clinical social worker with many years of experience working with refugees, immigrants, and other forcibly displaced populations. You've heard me mention this, that my professional work is founded on the intimate journey of my own family's experience as an immigrant and refugee, with a big emphasis that my experience is very limited and that it's not a blanket application to the unique experiences of others. We have Jessica Dalpe, who's also a licensed social worker and working as the Senior Technical Advisor for Safety and Wellness at International Rescue Committee. We have, thanks for turning on your camera. We also have Lauren Mai, who's a clinical psychologist and researcher who serves as the Technical Advisor, Mental Health and Psychosocial Support for International Rescue Committee. So you'll be seeing both Jessica and Lauren soon. All right, here are our learning objectives. By the end of today's webinar, we're hoping that we can help you identify practical and best practice approaches to effectively support our refugee clients, we hope to identify key cultural considerations for goal setting and case management. And then we also hope to have to build and integrate a multi-tiered and client-centered approach. Before we do that, again, for those of you that have joined us for the last 2 series, you might recognize the survey. And for those that are new, we recognize that we have a lot of people with different backgrounds and experiences joining us today. So we would love to ask for you to take the survey. It's brief and voluntary, and it'll give us an idea of the different positions and specialties represented within the group. As I mentioned earlier, CARE is a project of the International Rescue Committee and the National Child Traumatic Stress Network via the generous support of SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration. The information that we gather from this survey will help CARE track and represent the reach of the webinar, and it'll also it'll only be used to access just the things that are needed to support and create additional mental health and trauma-informed care resources for you. However, unless you choose to join the list, your name and email address will not be used. So you should see that link with the survey link in the chat right now. And if you have any questions, you can let us know. I'm going to give you about a minute to complete that survey. Thank you. For those that are joining us now, welcome. All right, so this series is by far my favorite area of topic to talk about, to train on, and just simply do, because we get to dive in the relational and practical part of the work of working with our clients. We'll spend some time naming and practicing some skills and the techniques that we hope you'll be learning and will be helpful for you. We'll cover some common helping and communication approaches that assist us as caseworkers to effectively engage our clients with mental health and or psychosocial support needs. Considering the range of approaches, trainings, and education available, we'll only be able to cover just some things and not everything today. All right, we'll start with a very brief overview of what we discussed in the last 2 series, actually mostly the first series. If you remember, case management is a collaborative process that assesses, plans, implements, coordinates, and monitors, and also evaluates the options and services needed to meet individuals' needs. We've learned that it's a multifaceted layer with many players in it. So case managers' process is iterative, it is very nonlinear, and it's very cyclical. So what that means is the relationship could go various ways, as you can see in the diagram. And if you recall, we discussed the phases of case management in module 1. In the initial phase, we have the intake, the engagement, the assessment, the report building, which is taking place. This is your opportunity to introduce the idea of case management, your role, your client's role, and what they can expect from you in the process. It's the time when you get to know the client gets to know you, and you begin to identify the strengths, the resources, the barriers, and the needs that are present for the client. Then we move into the goal setting. This is where you assess and establish goals. The service provisions, right? You have referrals here as needed. This is where, as you can see on the diagram, this is where the step could take different routes. You can move into implementation of the interventions that are identified based on the goal, or you could be referring out because of advanced or further needs that may have been assessed. So this is where the bulk of case management happens. Though it cannot happen without the initial engagement and assessment, this is also where you develop an update. And then you also come up with the part where clients' goals are being kind of executed, or intervention is put in place. That's where that execution, intervention, or implementation takes place. From there, we're either terminating or we're referring out. When I say terminating, either services have ended and or services are no longer able to be met with you. As you can see, and I want to mention that the termination process sometimes has to begin in the beginning. You have to introduce where your services might end and or where your services might be veered towards a different course. So case management is an active cycle of movement between these phases. You could see the arrows going different ways, right? There's a number of trainings like motivational interviewing, active listening, and the psychological first aid training that you can take to receive that basic helper skill. All of them have this common competencies and skills and knowledge base in which to support individuals. Importantly, because the standards of care and ethical practice guide the professionalization of some of the skills in our do no harm principle, we must always remember to operate within the role and capacity and skills that we have. So how do we navigate through this cycle of using the key principles of case management that we learned in our previous training? Well, it starts with active listening. Case managers' first duty is really to their clients, right? In our role, it requires us to have many skills to help clients achieve their goals. There are numerous skills that case managers will use to accomplish what is needed for a client, and each case manager will develop his or her own personal style of performing those skills. Some case management skills are learned informally through some life experience, while others are learned and kind of practiced and developed through some formal training. There are a number of trainings, like I said, motivational interviewing, psychological first aid that you can receive to kind of increase your ability to use, right? One of the most essential skills of an effective case manager is active listening. Communicating with people and receiving information from them is a very difficult task. And among the reasons communication is so complicated is that it just involves more than the verbal communication. Focusing more on our refugee clients we serve, we have the added layer of trauma, we have language, we have the cultural norms and expectations, which also make it even more difficult to master the skill. The good news is, and I hope that this could be your takeaway, active listening is a skill. It's not a trait, meaning you're not just born with it. So we can learn it, we can practice it, and we can, and as you use it more and more, you get better at it. Because our work is so complex, we must continuously try to grow and hone in on this skill. So active listening, like I said, is one of the key of successful communication that you can have with your clients. In addition to a set of skills, case managers need to put into practice some basic values of the helping relationship. When we are active listening, as you could see on your screen, we're offering some undivided attention. We're saying to understand, we're deferring any judgments that we might have, and we're also doing all of these things while maintaining respect. Active listening goes hand in hand with psychoeducation, culturally informed approaches, rapport building, and we'll just talk about this a little bit later, but I just wanted to mention that. One last slide before we kind of start exercising together. Active listening techniques include paraphrasing, summarizing, expressing empathy, and paying attention to the nonverbal cues. And these are just some of the active listening. I'm sure there's a list of other things that we could learn. When we're paraphrasing, we're restating the content of the client's previous statement. We're paraphrasing, we're using words that are similar to the client, but with very fewer words. And we'll practice this in a little bit. The purpose of paraphrasing is to communicate to the client that you understand what they're saying. When you're summarizing, it's really an important way to gather together what has already been said. And you're making sure that the client has been understood correctly. You're preparing the client to move on, right? Your summarizing is putting together a group of reflections for the client to connect with you. You're repeating to say, have I gotten this information correct? Expressing empathy is really, it communicates that you care, that you are aware and sensitive to the feelings, to the thoughts, and the experiences of your clients. Communicating with people and receiving information is just beyond verbal communication. And we have a really cool exercise for you in a little bit. So in the nonverbal cues, we're considering all that is not said. We're noticing our body movement, our posture, our gesture. We're observing cues like our eye contact, our touch, our space, right? And also we're listening to the tone of voice when they are speaking, right? That's the unsaid thing. We will now have some exercise to apply what we have learned for you with just a few exercises. And bear with us, we were having some technical issues with Slido, so we may have to switch into chat. Here's an example of paraphrasing. So a client comes to you and says, I'm so stressed with my life here in America. So many things are difficult. I'm stressed all the time. As I give you one kind of answer as an example of what you would say as a worker, I would love for you to think through some responses of how you could give an answer if you were the worker. So one way is, I hear what you're saying. That's very stressful here in America. Really, you're just repeating what the client said, right? Using a different word. Let's see. I see that we're still having some issues with Slido. So Tanisha, if you could activate chat so that we could use it, that would be great. And for those of you, if you could go to your chat and type some answers, and I can pull up the chat to read out some answers that have come in. I'll give us just a few. There we go. If you're the worker, what else might you say in the response to this client? Great. What can I do to make things easier for you? Let's see what else we can do to make it less stressful. So really, you're listening to your clients. Thank you. How can I help you? Whoa, it's going in super fast, which is why we turn off the chat. It sounds like you're having a hard time with the stress here. Great. These are all really thoughtful, paraphrasing responses. I'm so sorry you're feeling this way. How can I help you? And I think you're also using that empathy. I am so sorry you're feeling this way. You're asking a client what specifically is stressful to better understand. How can I help? Can you help me by telling me what you mean by stressful? Great. Thank you. Those are really good answers, actually. All right, let's move on to the next exercise. And for this one, you could either use, again, as I'm reading out an example of what the client might or the worker might say, maybe think through how you might summarize this. So your client comes and says, my landlord told us that we have to start paying more rent. We don't have enough money. I miss my mother and I just cannot stop crying. Our resettlement money is all gone. What will we do? And I'm curious to see what your answer would be. Oops, sorry. One answer is, today we covered a lot of topics. You shared with me your concerns about your housing and that your benefits are ending. We explored the steps we'll take to secure housing and some additional benefits, right? You also mentioned crying a lot. Let's see what answers you guys have typed. Again, there's a lot of questions coming in. All right. I'll try my best to make it easy for you by understanding your situation. You're kind of giving confirmation, right? Okay, paying more, question mark. This is where you're asking for more questions, right? The summary includes sometimes some clarifying questions. What I'll do is I'll go to the next, just because this is kind of a very dense summary, I'll go to the next one, but I do see some answers coming in, so I'd love to read it out. I'm sorry to hear that. Let me see what resources we have available for you. There we go. Managing limited resources is always stressful. I'll check your benefits if we can help with rent. We can offer you a referral to our mental health services to explore that further and help. Great, thank you. Keep the answers coming so that your colleagues could also see some of those answers. All right, Here is another one. You're now expressing empathy, right? The client says to you, I'm lost. I don't know what to do. And as a worker, so that you can have some time to type what other responses that you would share with me, I would say, I hear you. You're feeling some loss of identity and connection to your community. Life in the US is hard. I hear you're saying that this is not what you thought it would be. So you're really sitting with your clients and expressing empathy. You're recognizing the hardship. This is totally natural. So you're really giving them some confirmation that this is a shared feeling. We can help you with that. I hear you. What you need help first with any preference. And so you just kind of are giving them also, you're saying, I hear you. I understand you. I'm sitting here with you. I am so sorry to hear that. Let's think about some of the solutions. Boy, you guys are so fast. I can barely keep up, but I hope that you guys are looking at the chat. We'll find out what we can do for you. Life is hard in the US. However, we can find some relief for you. These are all really, really, really good ways to express empathy and be present for your client. All right, so this is what we just did, but we'll skip that since you guys are using the chat function. I will now hand it over to Loanne, who is going to take us to the next interaction, which will also use the chat function since our Slido is not working today. You can open that chat like you have and keep that. With that, Loanne, if I can hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Tigest. Hello, everyone. So glad to be with you today, and I'll make sure to speak a bit louder and clearer for everyone. And so we're really glad to bring this to you because, as Tigest was saying, it gives us an opportunity to go into very much more practical skills in detail. I'd like you to take a look at this picture right now, and let's see what's happening in this picture. We should look at how we interact, perceive, contribute, and engage in the environment with clients all the time so that we can be more culturally informed, appropriate, and sensitive, of course, all of which allows us to move to a place of trust with clients. So in this picture, let's consider in terms of body language and nonverbal. Yes, no one is smiling. Thank you, Stephanie. That's absolutely true. Nonverbal cues are key when we're working with clients. And Mina and Farid are seen here with their caseworker sitting in the middle with the scarf, and the interpreter sitting on the left side, the gentleman with the glasses. And this is their first home visit. For the purpose of our learning for this exercise, what I'd like you to do is consider what the observations are. Yeah, I see a lot of good chat comments in here. So we're asking you to look at the hand gesture, the body posture, the physical distance, the shoulders, in terms of the position of the shoulders. Yes, I see all the chats. It's wonderful. You guys have it. The key thing about being culturally appropriate in this situation is being culturally informed, which Tigest spoke about and we spoke about in the last session. As you notice, the caseworker is sitting to the side of the client because in some cultures, sitting, depending upon gender, sitting right in front of someone or standing in front of someone can be seen as confrontational. So we do have to be very careful about what we do know and don't know, seek out information and learning so we can read body cues and nonverbals appropriately. I think everyone on here who's entering in the chat is really noticing very well the nonverbals. Thank you so much. So let's go to the next slide. So in this, in terms of the shoulders being slumped, turning away, speaking quietly, body language, these are part of the nonverbal cues. For ourselves, we have to be aware of how we're in the situation physically as well. We should be sure that we can have an open posture and that we leave adequate space for the client. And if appropriate, consider if eye contact would be helpful with engagement. Now, with remote work, which a lot of folks are doing, it may be more challenging to be able to read that, particularly since sometimes with remote work, you only have the audio and not necessarily the video as well. But in remote work, And if it's only audio, you may be able to notice, obviously, the tone of the person, the tone of their voice, whether there are pauses that leaves a lot of silence, whether there are cues visible on the screen, if it is with a video option, obviously. So if they seem distracted and they can't seem to look at you in the video, or if they're fidgeting and they can't sit still or sit straight, or if they keep moving the screen. So there are ways, I'm sure you've noticed in your remote work, if you're doing video contact with clients, you've seen some differences with how clients may present to you. So for in-person work, we like you to consider the physical position in terms of where you are in relation to the client and the environment. How is your physical position maybe affecting how the client sees you and feel that you're engaged with them? So in that sense, trauma-informed care in terms of the organizational structure is also about the physical layout of making sure a client feels welcomed and can be present with you. Is your office set up in a way that it creates a power dynamic in the room? Is the chair or where you're sitting, is it behind a desk and it creates a barrier to the client? And again, being aware of the client's cultural values and expressions is really important with this. So we like to go to the next activity, and we're going to use chat. We're going to be very flexible with this and ask you what you see. I'm sorry, I think I moved on to the next one already. Okay, so working with interpreters. What are the considerations of working with interpreters? Language is a crucial factor in determining a client's patient's needs, strengths and abilities. Family or friends should not be used as interpreters, obviously, because their personal relationship and their proficiency with language can influence what is being interpreted. A pre-session is recommended always. It can be, termed as a pre-conference or a pre-encounter. It's a short conversation between the provider and the interpreter that takes place away from the client, not in front of them, prior to beginning their interpretation session. The purpose of a pre-session is to introduce the provider-interpreter to ensure that both understand the interpreter's role and to share key information about the session, as well as understanding terms of what could be difficult or specific to interpret for the client. Opening the session involves once the provider, interpreter, and client are together and ready to start the session, we ask you to consider that it's important to orient the client by leading a brief introduction into the session. It's especially useful, we feel, when clients are new to communicating through interpreters, and also letting them know in terms of interpretation services, the confidentiality of what they're shared is also extended to the interpreter in their role. We should also consider in terms of availability and selection of interpreter who would be appropriate, and what the client may prefer, if there are gender-specific issues or age-specific issues, if there's flexibility in accommodating that for the client. We should not be using family members or staff inappropriately, and that could raise a lot of boundary issues for the client, which we don't want to create. And active listening to interpretation includes looking at body language of the interpreter as well, and how they're responding to the client and the client's responding to them. The context of the interpretation and understanding, and how there are certain reactions to nonverbal cues. So not only are we being aware of how we are in the moment and how the client is sitting with it, but we should also be aware of how the interpreter is engaging and interacting and is being present. Is there appropriate spacing and responses and reactions that are helpful in this conversation and with the services, or there's some clearly nonverbal cues that the interpreter is demonstrating that could be a concern. So we need to include how the interpreter is sitting in the moment as well. We have a toolkit we would put in the chat for you. It's a toolkit that comes from Switchboard. Please consider looking at this guideline for working with interpreters. Thank you. So we're on to the next slide, cultural considerations for goal setting. So we ask you to avoid minimizing the importance of cultural specific experiences that are important to the client, such as recognizing honorific titles that family members may have for each other, or their preference of how to call or recognize each other's names. Identify cultural needs that influence goals and services, such as when prayers are observed and setting appointments that are reflective of those practices and not requiring them to come up with at the appointment time when they probably would be more comfortable with their faith or religious practice. Avoid a superior perspective in judging the client's behavior or response, which may be grounded in cultural value, such as gender differences in certain cultures that are not similar to your own, unless the client brings it up to you. We do not want to make disparaging comments, of course, on the differences, which does not help us to work towards trust or being culturally appropriate. And all of this we know is about in terms of being trauma-informed, and also about building trust in that model so that we can really engage with the client. Avoid pull to internalize the client's reaction to you based on cultural stereotyping, such as why some male clients may not shake your hand if you're a female worker. We must make sure to respect cultural expressions that have value for our clients. Obviously, also avoid assumptions based on biases, such as generalizations of experiences or expressions of subgroups, since there are also differences between subgroups that could exist, and we don't want to marginalize clients who share that background. So we also have a reference for you. It's going to be in your chat as well. It's Improving Cultural Competence, and it comes from SAMHSA. So we have a poll question on the next slide, and with it, we can use a Zoom function. So that is working for us today. And what I'd like you to do is read this. Which of the following are potential goals for a client? And it's multiple choice, so please go ahead, put in your multiple choice answers, and then we'll respond to it in about 30 seconds. So please answer it now. Great, look at that. Wonderful. I love it, you guys are so engaged. Okay, so this was a bit of a trick question we put out there. And while all of these could be very appropriate goals, we'd like you to consider, look at that. Yeah, I see the poll. Responses and vocational, medical, public benefits, education, stable and independent housing, transportation, all of those seem very appropriate, viable goals to work towards. And what we'd like you to think about though, for example, some clients may not have experienced education as an opportunity or as a natural pathway in life. Education may have been selected based on class, gender, geographical area, and age. We can't assume education has the same value or meaning as a goal, and must be curious about the client enough to ask the value and experience of education for the client. So we do ask you to consider how cultural experiences and values may complicate or bring a different lens to what we think goals should be for the client. And in that way, it's part of what the first training is, really approaching it collaboratively with the client. And likewise, for some clients, stable housing clearly sounds very straightforward as a goal of self-sufficiency, but it may be impacted by gender, in that it may not be a decision that the client may be familiar with due to gender, class, and living alone may not be condoned by some cultural values for certain gender or age group. So in this slide here, in terms of cultural lens values impacting goal setting, what we would like you to consider that there are different viewpoints and cultural expressions and values that impact goal setting. So for individuals from a collectivism versus an individualism perspective, we think of references to we that the client may make rather than I in terms of statements of what they want. It may reflect a focus on family rather than the experience of the individual need or wishes, which would impact the identification of a goal. For individuals coming from more of a behavioral approach in expressing themselves versus emotional, they may actually look to see for, you may actually look to see for references of what to do rather than what they, quote, feel that they want. It may reflect a focus on performance-based goal setting rather than an emotional identification with the goal. Not that one is bad or good, but that we must be able to listen to hear how the client is wording what they want and to be able to be respectful and reflect that in their goals so that we can work collaboratively. Also, for some clients, they come from an environment or a value where they prefer didactic versus reflective goal setting. And this is more of a preference to approach as a learning process with the expectation to be told or informed about what to do. And they may prefer handouts so that they have something in terms of a material to read and to hold on to as proof that they're working on something versus a much more reflective process. So we do ask you to consider when you do goal setting that how someone may express or language what they want is something that you're actively listening deeply to. So cultural adaptation and acculturation impacting goal setting. Changes in family member roles, values, and beliefs can shift the goal setting process and focus, obviously. For instance, a wife working when previously not, when it was culturally not acceptable for them. Children speaking English more fluently than parents may shift roles and power dynamics that we have to consider. An emphasis on education, when education was considered a privilege for some, therefore education is not an immediate natural pathway in terms of goal. And for maybe a father who's working in manual labor when he was previously an esteemed teacher or in a professional role. So when we think about goal setting, we have to think about what changes these goals bring to them and how they will be able to identify with it and move with it. So for this case scenario, what I like to do is have you read it with me. And because we do have an activity that's connected to this case scenario. Santo, his fiance, Maria, and their two sons, ages 5 and 8, are seeking asylum in the US from their home in Mexico. Santo is a transgender man, though he is not fully out in his gender identity. His passport and immigration documentation list his gender as female. Santo and Maria fled their home due to harassment and violence, pressuring them to be wives of local cartel members. Additionally, they face violence and discrimination through their open lesbian partnership. Both children are Santo's biological children, and Santo reports that he and the children are experiencing depression and anxiety due to their experience at the border when they were separated from Maria. The family is currently residing in private temporary housing and are working with a pro bono law clinic for their asylum application. So with the next activity, although we won't be on Slido, we have the chat that will open. And we ask you to think about what the goals could be that would be supportive of Santos and his life with Maria, consider the principles of trauma-informed care and all the varying cultural aspects that influence and shape Santos' life. We ask you to type into the chat what goals would be supportive for Santos, considering the discussion around cultural issues and values. Housing, mental health, childcare, connect to City College, affirming their relationship. Yes, housing, reunited with their wife, with Santos' wife, yes. LGBTQ support groups, yes. Support with legal. You guys are going in there. Awesome. I love it when you all respond. Psychological family services, mental health service, connect Santos with the local LGBT community. Housing, childcare, absolutely. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much. These are great goals to consider and how it could be fitting for Santos and make it relevant for him, but also in terms of being sensitive to what their emotional, cultural experiences in plural could be. Thank you. We'll go to the next one. So diversity and appropriateness of goal setting. Let's think about what goals would be supportive. Oh, I forgot that part. Sorry, responses. Let's see. Clients come from a diverse community. Be aware of the differences that may exist within the client's community and cultural group. Learn about the various faith and spiritual differences of the client's cultural group to engage in acceptable interchanges that support goal setting, all of which we also just captured. But we do ask that you consider 1, 2, 3 in terms of the diversity and the appropriateness of the goal setting. Thank you, and we'll bring it back to Tigist.
Thank you, Luann. That was a lot for us to cover between me and you. So we're just gonna give you about 2 minutes for stretching, hydration, whatever you need. And we will be back and we'll have Jess have us finish us off. And then we'll launch into our Q&A. So we already see lots of great questions that you've put it in the Q&A. Also, if you haven't taken the CARE survey, now would be a great time for you to do that. So thank you again and see you shortly.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully you had a nice stretch break and were able to really kind of take a minute to look away from your computers, but really happy to be here with you all. I'm Jess, as I think many of you have known, and I know Tigist had done an introduction, but really happy to jump into talking a bit with you all on kind of our part 3 for today, which is really talking about building and integrating a multi-tiered client-centered approach. And I want to just say, as we're getting into this, I am loving all of the energy in the chat and all the fantastic responses that you all have had. So thank you all for such great participation. And as we move into this next slide here, on it yet? There we go. Just wanted to make sure we're keeping up with each other here. So one of the key areas of case management is the actual provision of services, right? And the mobilization of the strengths and supports that exist to help clients access the services, opportunities, and resources that they want and that they need. And so that's what we're really going to focus in a little bit on right now. This kind of part of the work of services and accessing, providing services includes working across multiple different levels. That's kind of what we're looking at here on this slide, right? So we're looking at helping clients activate their systems of support. So that can include family, friends, supportive groups like schools and faith-based communities. It also can include activating the client's internal resources, right? Their traits, their characteristics that they have to really help them find success in meeting their goals. Oftentimes as case managers in this process, our role can include things like reminding clients of their strengths, such as their persistence, the skills that they have, or their natural temperament and way of being in the world. As we move on to kind of this middle box that we have here, at this level, we're looking at connecting clients to services that we provide, right, within case management and that our organization may provide. This can include things like emotional support in casework, using that empathic communication and those active listening skills that y'all did a fantastic job of demonstrating in the chat. It can also include referring to internal services, such as ESL classes. And we saw we had some ESL instructors in the audience today, so glad you're all here. It can also include other departments within your organization, like housing, economic well-being, or any other services and programs that you offer within your organization. And it can include accessing agency resources, such as donations or direct assistance, right? That level of what can you provide in conjunction with your colleagues within your agency. This third level over here on the right is really referring to and coordinating services that are outside of your agency or organization. This is where other providers come in. In order to do this, right, we must first understand who in our community provides accessible quality services. So we're going to talk a little bit about service mapping, because this is where it comes in terms of those services and the referrals. So what is service mapping? I'm sure everyone on this call has heard of service mapping in some way, and you could probably explain it really well. It's really the process of looking at the resources, the referral lists, and really tracking the different service providers in your area. This is critical to the success of supporting any client in their navigation of services that might be necessary for their stability and for their support. Right? It's really important that we're focusing in on service mapping because, as we've talked about in previous sessions as part of this series, right, there are important boundaries to the case management relationship. We as case managers are not meant to do or be everything, right? We can't provide all of the services that clients need. And a lot of what we do is provide that connection and that support in helping clients access the services that they want. So when we are doing service mapping, what we're really focusing on is really knowing what exists. And to know not just that, like, oh yeah, I know that there's that provider that's down the street and I know that they're there, but to know how they're functioning, how to access services. And then part of service mapping is kind of beyond identifying who's there. It's also identifying gaps. And how you can maybe work with partners to begin to address the gaps in the service kind of web that exists to support clients. So when you are service mapping on this next slide, oh, yeah.
Sorry, Jess. Could I have you fix your, I think there's some feedback coming. I don't know if it's your hand gesture. I know we're very
sorry
as we talk, but if I can just give you a moment to fix that so that we can,
So
Go
sorry
for it. If
about
you need
that.
to unmute and if you need to unmute and or mute and kind of try to fix it,
Yeah.
that's fine.
Sorry, everyone.
No
Let's mute and
problem.
try again. Is that any better?
Yes, that's good. Thank
Okay,
you.
it's probably
Sorry
just
to
hitting
interrupt.
my scarf. It's the
Yeah.
scarf's fault. Blame it on the scarf and the
No
cold weather
problem.
here on the East
No
Coast.
problem.
Thanks
Here we
for
go.
interrupting, Tigist. And sorry, everyone, if you weren't able to hear and for that the background. I know it's never fun to have background noise. But back to service mapping, where we are. As we are mapping services, it can be helpful to kind of follow the 4 W's of service mapping. And so what we're really looking at is who, right? Who in our community is providing culturally and linguistically appropriate services within our service community. Now, I know many of us on this call have very wide-ranging service communities. So it's looking at maybe where are the pockets of service providers in different towns or different regions within our communities. And then we're looking at the what. Right? What are the services that are provided? And what does mobilizing kind of these services and resources look like? So are they case management services? Are they counseling and mental health services? But really understanding what does that entail, right? If it's case management services that maybe you're referring out for a specific reason, what does that look like? Is it weekly meetings? Is it maybe a monthly check-in, right? So trying to understand really what does that service look like? And then we're looking at when, right? When can clients access these services? What are the hours of operation? What are the eligibility requirements or situations, right? Does the client have to be in a particular state or situation to be eligible to access services? Do they have to be in the US for a certain amount of time, right? So thinking about that kind of time aspect. And then finally, where are services provided? Right? Do clients have to go to an office? Do they have to go to another community meeting place? Can they access services in their home, or can they access services even within your office? And then as you're going through these 4 W's, you're also looking at questions around how you actually refer clients to these services and how do you create and maintain those relationships with providers. And so as you're doing this, right, you have your service mapping, you are identifying the partners. It's helpful to ask ourselves a few different questions around how we can create service partnerships that are of quality and that are lasting. So we can move to the next slide. And so this is where we are looking at partners, and we're really not saying, okay, does the resource and service exist? But we're actually doing a little assessment, right? So we're assessing for the organization's values, for their contextual awareness. Do they know what it looks like to provide services to individuals who have faced forced displacement? We're looking at the quality of their services and their reputation in the community, right? Are they a trusted provider? And I know that sometimes we are in communities where we don't have very many service providers to choose from. And so even just being aware of things, so maybe it's a provider that doesn't have the best reputation, but it's the only provider that's available. Let's say it's going to the welfare office, right? Going to get public benefits. Generally, that's not something people enjoy doing. Generally, those are not very supportive experiences for a number of reasons. But knowing that ahead of time as we're providing referrals and as we're supporting clients in accessing those services. And then what we're looking at is really trying to create a relationship with those other service providers. So creating opportunities for regular collaboration that may look like advocacy or project development or other community connections that we could be involved in. And then sometimes this can really look like identifying focal points across relationships to maintain and grow the relationship. So across these organizations, to maintain and grow relationships, because we know there is lots of turnover in this work, but we want to try to have that continuity of services so that there are focal points. There are people that we can reach out to and say, hey, at the mental health clinic, I know that I can give Tigist a call and I can facilitate a referral through that process of talking to Tigist. And if Tigist isn't there, she'll connect me to someone else within the organization, a supervisor, a colleague who can help. So that brings us to referrals, right? We talked a lot, both Juan and Tigist talked a lot about all of the wonderful ways that we as case managers provide services. This is, again, how we're focusing on helping clients access other services. So we have kind of 6 different steps that we can take to provide a referral. And these often kind of flow together, and we're going to have an example of it in just a slide or two. But really what we're doing is we're focusing in on first that validation and the normalization of what the client is experiencing. You all did such a fantastic job of this in the chat. I saw so much validation, so much normalization as you were practicing those empathic communication and active listening skills. In that, right, we're also acknowledging the strengths. So not coming at this from a deficit perspective of saying, that something is wrong or missing, and that's where these services will come in, but really acknowledging the strengths that have helped the client get to the point where they are now, and acknowledging the strength in accessing continued services. And then when we have the time and when it is appropriate for the service, really exploring the culture and the context, right? Being able to see what the client thinks about those services, what their impression is, what maybe their past experiences have been. And then we have the last few steps where we come in and we get to provide that education and those resources so that we can encourage choice and empowerment, right? Going back to our last session, excuse me, where we were talking about trauma-informed care, right? So being able to provide the information and encourage the client's choice and empowerment, right? Referrals are a choice. They are an option for clients to accept that referral or to decline it, which is where the final step comes in, though we are not done at the final step. We'll talk about that in a few slides. But the final step of creating a referral is getting the client's consent for that referral. This oftentimes includes having them sign a release of information so that you can share some information with the referring partners, that you can say, hey, call up, you can call Tigist up at the clinic down the street and say, Tigist, I have a client who's interested in services. I am sending you the release of information. They've consented to have me talk to you. Let's try to help them set up an appointment. Okay. So we're going to look at this in practice. So we have a few slides of talking about referring for mental health services. I know there's a lot on these slides. Apologies for all of the text, but an example of kind of these first few steps of normalizing and validating, identifying strengths, and offering resources and exploring culture and context are here. So one example of this is, if you're talking to a client and you're thinking about having a referral for mental health services, you might say, many people we work with have gone through similar things to what you are describing right now, right? Normalization. They have felt better after talking to someone about these experiences. You have been doing a great job staying connected with loved ones to help manage the stress, but sometimes we all need extra support during particularly difficult times. In the United States, talking to a counselor, therapist, mental health worker, right? You can choose the language that you might want to use based on conversations you've had. But talking to a counselor does not mean that you are crazy. This person is a type of healthcare worker who will listen to you, provide guidance or support, and may help make things better. What has your experience been with mental health services in the past? Right? So really exploring that culture and context, and having that discussion with the client. Then we're looking at the next slide. If this is so, you have a conversation, right? Then you can continue to offer education and resources and encourage choice and empowerment, and then finally obtaining consent. So you can say, if this is something you would be interested in talking about more, I could refer you to name of the person who works with, name of the organizations, right? I could refer you to Tigist, who works at the community mental health clinic. We can talk to them together and you can decide if you'd like to enroll in services. You and I will still continue to work together. If they consent, then you can say, great. Tigist will be contacting you with a professional interpreter within a couple of days. They will begin by getting to know you. They will describe the type of support they offer and will ask you questions about how you are doing. Do you have any questions, right? So really being able to provide that anticipatory guidance making sure that we're explaining to the client what they should expect from this process and opening it up for questions. So from here, you're making the referral, but we're not done yet. So we then are looking at effective collaboration. How do we ensure that we are collaborating in a way that is best supporting our clients in reaching the goals that they have set? Oftentimes in our work, right, we are working with clients who have really complex service needs. And sometimes we can feel stuck or overwhelmed in this process. And that's common and that is okay, right? There's a lot that we're managing. And we're going to talk about this in the next session. So in 2 weeks from today, if you want to join us, we'll talk a little bit about managing that feeling of overwhelm. Oh, can we actually just go back a slide? Sorry, not quite there yet. Thank you. But one of the things that we can do is discuss with our supervisor, right, to get some of the support if we're feeling overwhelmed. And sometimes there may be some additional support, and that's where case consultations and case conferences can come in. So they can help us to identify solutions, they can help to reduce duplication of services, and to help improve client outcomes. So we do have a guide that we put together to accompany the next few slides. It's a guide for effective consultations and case conferences, and that will be included in your recommended resources and also in the Switchboard library. So we're talking about it now, you also have access to a resource. Moving on to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit first about case consultations, and then I'll talk about case conferences. So there's a difference. They sound very similar, lots of C's in these, but a case consultation is really a process to help us better understand best practices, a presenting situation, a process, or a population, right? So these are generally informal processes in which a staff member will seek out specialized support or guidance to better understand how to work in an area of scope that's maybe a little bit outside of their regular practice. And so it might be, right, that they are working with a presenting situation that is new and unfamiliar, or a process that they haven't worked with before. The important thing to remember about a case consultation is that it does not include sharing any identifying information about the client or the particular situation, right? The amount of detail is shared is minimal, and only information that's directly relevant to that consultation should be shared. So, right, we're not sharing any personal information. We want to make sure that we're not sharing names or anything that could identify the client, because we want to maintain confidentiality in the case consultation process. An example of this is that maybe you're working with a client who has recently shared with you that they are experiencing intimate partner violence. In the moment, right, you responded with all of your active listening and empathic communication techniques. You offered them referrals for specialized services, but they declined those referrals. And so after speaking with your supervisor and getting some guidance, you both agree that it would be helpful for you to reach out to a colleague who specializes in intimate partner violence, so that you can ask that colleague for general support and guidance to best support your client. You don't share the survivor's name, your client's name, or any other identifying information such as where they live, who their partner is, or their country of origin, unless that's relevant, but you're able to present the situation and ask for general advice and guidance. So that's where case consultations come in, and they can be a great tool to help support in those moments where you maybe are unfamiliar with a particular situation or a particular population or experience. Which then brings us to case conferencing, which is a bit different. So when cases are often quite complex or possibly high risk, or they involve multiple different systems or providers. They could be internal providers, right? Maybe you have a client that's receiving services from multiple departments in your office, or external providers. Sometimes a case conference might be helpful. Sometimes we also call case conferencing case staffing, depending upon the language and terms used in your organization, but generally they are the same kind of process. But a case conference is really a planned and structured meeting with multiple different participants who come from different organizations or different services. And it's centered around a shared client to ensure the client's best outcomes, right? So oftentimes we use case conferencing when a client or individual's needs are not being met. It may be to help us identify or clarify ongoing service provision coordination issues, right? If there are multiple providers and we're like, hey, we're not coordinating very well, how we're supporting this client in this very complex situation. We may do it to address or prevent duplication of services. And overall, the goal of case conferencing is to provide a client with, or their family with, a more holistic, integrated, and coordinated set of services. This is different from case consultation in that we are talking about a particular client and their situation. So this does require release of information, right, by all people who are part of the case conference. And oftentimes we may be including a client in a case conference so that they can have part of that agency and that ownership and be a part of this process. Sometimes that may not be feasible, that may not be appropriate. So at the very least, we should have a conversation with the client about the conference so that they're aware of what's happening and that their needs, wants, and voice will be represented in the case conference, even if they are not present to use their voice and to be able to represent their needs. And so I think we have some time. We have one quick exercise we're going to go through, and then we'll wrap up and move on to questions. Okay, thanks, Tigest. Also, I'm imagining my sound is better. I'm not hitting my scarf as much.
You're doing great. You sound and yep, keep going.
So we're revisiting Santo and Maria here. So we have moved on. We're at a different time and point with them. And we're thinking about a case conference. So we have Santo, Maria, and their children. They've been working with a local community-based organization that provides mental health and case management services for the LGBTQIA+ community. Santo has expressed that these services have been helpful to him in navigating his process of coming out as a trans man and updating his paperwork to reflect his gender identity. Both children have been engaged in services at school as they've been getting in some trouble for not following their teacher's directions and getting into altercations with other children. Santo and Maria are also working with an employment program to help them find sustainable work as they both have had a difficult time maintaining steady employment. The family's housing remains temporary and they are facing a move-out date in a few weeks without any options for additional housing. So you're deciding that you want to put together a case conference. And so I'd love to hear from all of you in the chat. What are some considerations that you may have in thinking about the case conference? What might you want to be talking about? What might be some concerns and some considerations in preparation for a case conference? We'll leave this slide up and I'll take a look at the chat, hear from all of you.
It takes just a few minutes, I think. So, Tanisha, if you haven't already, if you can activate it, there we go. It's coming through. Thank you.
Yes, housing, right? So everyone's thinking, right, that immediate safety and stability. We have housing needs that are coming up. Wonderful. Prioritizing situations, right? So being able to also reflect what is Santo's priority and Maria's priority in this. Thinking about supports for the children, right? Additional kind of ways to get them supported in employment. Yes, great question, right? In preparation, identifying who will be present at the conference and informing the family, right? Having that conversation. Great. Right, and with outside providers, I see someone wrote in here, not bringing up, it seems like LGBTQIA+ isn't needed, I'm seeing in there. So, right, being mindful of what if Santo is out with all of the providers, what the different identities are, and what is necessary to share in the case conference. Just because everyone's coming together doesn't mean that we talk about everything, but that we're prioritizing. Great. Addressing barriers. Wonderful. Talking about mental health, being able to ask how everyone's doing. Y'all are doing a great job. And I look forward to reading all of the messages. But right, as you all had mentioned, right, and as we see on this slide, we're looking at kind of that preparation of making sure that we are thinking about the impact of trauma on the family, how that's showing up in places like school and employment, right? Some of the things that we talked about last session that we had. As we mentioned, being aware of what Santo and how comfortable he is with all of the providers, how much information he has shared about his gender identity. And then at the conference, really thinking about what goals aren't being met. How can we come together as service providers to support the family? And how can we ensure that we're not duplicating services, but that we're working together to the best of our ability to maximize the resources and services available to really support Santo Maria and their children. Y'all did a great job. And now I will hand it over to Tigest, and we're gonna go to some of the questions that y'all have in the chat here.
All right. Thank you all for your patience. That was a lot to cover, but we figured this is our last kind of compact way for us to present the fundamentals of case management. Our very last series is going to take place on April 19th, I believe, Tuesday, April 19th. We actually have a guest speaker. And if you haven't already, please go ahead and register for the webinar. It is kind of putting together everything we've covered and discussing the balancing needs of this unique work that we do. So I hope to see you all then. For now, we actually have quite a lot of time to dive into Q&As, and we do see a lot that came in. Maybe I'll start with that. I also recognize that we have some questions that came in, so I'll try to kind of blend it together. So the first one that got a lot of votes is, how do you validate stress client is expressing while also reiterating you are a case manager and not their therapist in a very respectful and trauma-informed way? Who wants to take that? Maybe I'll give this to you, Lauren, since I'm just finished and might need some time, and as a therapist.
Sure, I'm happy to do it. I think, individually for us, we know stress can be so difficult, right? And I think just being able to say, I know stress is hard. Everyone experiences stress differently, but stress can be really impactful, and it can affect how we go through our day. It can affect our sleep. It can affect if we, are eating well or not even. So how about I find you someone who's actually going to help you understand stress and talk about what that means, because, it's really important to have one spot to be able to go through all that and make it for you personal so that you can figure out what you can do different that could help. I think introducing it that way to say, I know someone who's really good at doing this. And then saying, let me connect you to them if you like. Because what you're experiencing in terms of normalizing and putting a cultural perspective on it as well, in terms of adaptation and acculturation, saying it can be hard. So let me see who and how I can connect you to this.
All right, I muted myself. All right, we'll move on to the next question. How do you make eye contact when your client culture do not use eye contact? I'm happy to take this one. I know there's a lot of trainings that we've provided on cultural consideration, and I think realizing and knowing your cultures, both your own cultures and also your client's culture is the key, right? If you know that your client's culture does not like to make eye contact, then really you don't have to. However, how else can you find a way to be present? How else do you show that you are listening and or you are present and or that you hear them. So really finding the balance of both your own comfort to make sure that you respect the cultural considerations of that client, and also relaying and making sure that you have the ability to express and communicate and build rapport with your client. So really, it is recognizing and meeting halfway for the needs of your clients and also your comfort zone. All right, there is one, and I haven't read it out, so hopefully it's okay. How do you recommend addressing situations where a client is hesitant or doesn't want to participate in something that is required? For example, a client has history that means that there is a distrust of the government, but must interact with government program with no alternative.
I feel like it's my turn to jump in.
Sure.
But welcome everyone's thoughts. I think this is a great question. There are a lot of mandated services that we have. A lot of the work that we do isn't always 100% client-centered, and that we just follow what the clients are asking. And so in this, right, what we need to do is try to have that space. I know this is hard. I know you all are very busy, have high caseloads and lots of things to do, but to have that space to just discuss a little bit, to understand kind of what that distrust is, and to be able to, right, really use your role as like the navigator, right, as understanding what's going on with these services, to say, this is what will happen. This is why we do these things. These are the protections that are in place. So really trying to do your best to demystify the process, because there's a lot that's very confusing about, especially the US government, but many governments. And so this is a confusing and a scary process, and doing our best to really go slow, to answer questions, and to provide that explanation as to what is going on, why these things are required, and how we can support the client through that process. But Tigist and Juan, I'd love to hear what y'all have to say. Shaking your head.
You're doing great. You've covered all the things. And for the interest of the many questions that we have, I'm just going to jump into the next one. Many cultures view disability or emotional barriers as shameful. How can we help our clients to step past the stigma? And what if they refuse? Sure, go for it.
I think we'll both chip in on this because it's a really good question, right? It's a really, actually, I think it's a very thoughtful question. So thank you for sending it in to us to look at and think about. One is that, if a client does not consent and you're approaching it still and pushing it, are you really doing it collaboratively, right? What you can say is acknowledge that it may not be a goal for them, but acknowledge from your professional experience that sometimes when we have emotional response to something that's difficult, it may hold up our goals in other areas. So it's only in concern that you're offering it. And I know in terms of for clients who come from cultures that may be very traditional bound in what is acceptable, and in terms of even language, in some language, they don't have words for feelings or even mental health. I'm actually Vietnamese, and in Vietnamese, the term for psychology doesn't exist. And so how you translate your intent to a client is really important in terms of how you make it accessible in the word that you're using that they could understand. So in Vietnamese, instead of saying mental health or instead of saying psychology, you say feeling and thought. Mm. And so you find some congruency with the client's culture, and that takes you learning, which you have to do. So you have to learn what is appropriate and what is acceptable and aligned to what's possible, and help them to understand that when we go through as humans, when we go through change, we have different reactions, and that affects all of our body senses and our ability to connect. And if we can learn what those things are, we can choose and have a choice to get to somewhere different that makes it feel better. So taking a learning approach usually helps a lot with the client, and welcome them to teach you how it would feel better.
Thank you, Lauren. I think there's another question that kind of goes along with that of cultural consideration. How do you deal with a How do you deal with a collectivism cultural context with a client who expects you to do everything for them and they will not take proactive actions on their own? What's the best way to deal with that? I'll take a stab at that, or just you can. I'll say, at least from having worked, my experience has been working with a lot of it is working with unaccompanied minors, and lots of them who have been on their own, but who certainly come from a very collectivism context where decisions are made with kind of their family members and or with what is deemed to be appropriate by society. And so really setting a very clear expectation from the beginning would help, right? When you're teaching your clients what to expect, and I know Jess covered this in the very first module of expectation and goal setting, you are saying, this is my role, this is your role. There are client rights and responsibilities that I'm sure your agency might have, and I think we also have, I believe Switchboard has also just released a blog on that, of rights and responsibilities that can help us guide the conversation around what is expected of the client and what is expected of you. Your role, or my role as your case manager, is to provide you with services such as X, Y, and Z. It is our expectation that you can pick these services, and or that it is our expectation that you can do such actions. And so really goal setting together, re-emphasizing your expectations, and also one exception, and I said this before, of sometimes when we make an exception to make something for a client, then it becomes an expectation. So really being clear about exceptions that we made so that our clients don't see it as an expectation of us to do it. So I'll leave it at that, because I think we can spend a lot of time talking about this. Let's see, another one that got a lot of votes. Oh, there we go. How can I respond when clients insist on using a friend or family members for interpretation? That's a good one. Who wants to take that?
That is a good one. I can take a first go at it. But I think in that it's really being able to, one, understand where the client's coming from and what is important to them, right? And maybe having that friend or family member that they trust, that they feel like they can get that information. And so being able to understand where the client's coming from, what is important, and what are their fears as it comes to interpretation. I also think this is where agency policy can kind of be your best friend. And so these are those moments when we can say, right, it is agency policy that we don't use friends or family members. You can still bring your friend or family member to your appointment, but we will have an interpreter available, because that's how we have to provide services, right? So being able to kind of fall back on your agency policy and best practices. So having that conversation with your supervisor, to understand what your policies are, and then to be able to really use them to support these best practices, right? To make sure that we are getting information to clients fully. Their friend and family member may be a fantastic interpreter, but we don't know that because we haven't been able to vet them. So that's why we want to make sure that we have our interpretation and then be able to say that it's backed up by policy.
Great answer. Yes, sometimes it helps to have my agency's rule is X, Y, and Z. It's my agency's rule not to meet with you on weekends, because guess what? That one exception we make is now an expectation. And not just, there's some times that you're able to do, but it also sets the precedent that you're now a better worker than your colleagues who may not replicate the same things that you might be doing. So really being considerate of some of the messages that we might be giving. All right, here's one around referral, Jess. What if you think you do not comprehend them? They do not comprehend the mental health referrals or other referrals you're giving them due to their mental health. What do you do?
That is a great question. And so I think first it's kind of thinking about, why do we think that they don't understand? Is that because, right, we're sensing that we're not having a conversation? Are we thinking that they don't understand the referral because they don't want the service? So where is that kind of coming from on our end, and what assumptions might we be making? And if we do feel like we're not able to adequately explain, or the client isn't able to process, then it's thinking about, okay, what is important to that client and how do we meet them where they are, right? Is getting them mental health services our priority, or is it their priority? And what ways are we seeing their mental health impacting their ability to comprehend referrals, right? Are we talking about mental health? Are we talking about maybe a traumatic brain injury? Are we talking about a developmental disability, right? What are we really looking at when we are saying that our clients aren't able to understand referrals? And then being able to identify what are our paths forward, right? Depending upon what might be going on, we might be looking at other referrals for medical care as an option and an opening, an entry point for additional mental health care. Those are the first things that kind of come to my mind, but Juan and Tigist would love to hear what your thoughts are on this one.
That was great, Jess. I think also in terms of just education, just saying, in here in the US, people have specialties. And the specialties are folks who really study really hard in that and then have different resource of who they would go to or how to get something done. So, this referral is for that specialty who has more knowledge or resource than I do in this area. And I think just being transparent about that, it's like, I wish I knew a lot more about housing. I know it's so important. And I know someone who is a specialist in this. Can I connect you with them? And can this be a referral that will help you to get to a better place with that goal? So I think explaining that this is a system in a way that allows them different resources that we may not have direct linkages to. And hopefully that sort of, as you walk that along with them, hopefully that makes it a little bit digestible in terms of receiving referrals.
Thank you. There's so many good questions in there, and I don't know how to pick the best ones for me to share, but there's just two things that I want to, we're at time here, so I would like to wrap up, but I do recognize one that got some votes. How do you talk to a client who identified their goal, need for referral to an inpatient treatment? And many service providers have been involved getting this to happen in a chosen facility, but client's timeline does not match with availability of the bed available. And client says that they will not go if it does not happen within a week, but facility's timeline takes 2 to 3 weeks. And the client knows this. This is one of the most frustrating parts of our job, right? When we're working with multidisciplinary and also especially inpatient settings that are so hard to get. And really there's some things that are within our ability, like talking to the clients and explaining the situation, but some that are not within our ability, getting a bed. So really, I picked this to say we sympathize and we empathize, and this is certainly an issue in an area that we've all come across, and continuing to have the conversation with the client to explain the referral process and really explain the systems that are involved will help. And I know this is probably easier said than done, but I guarantee you that hearing it over and over might help. And hopefully until then, keeping an eye close eye on the clients and having some safety plans in place and really harm reductions if it's needed is something that I would suggest. With that, unless you have anything quick things to add, I would love to go to the next. Love to wrap up our webinar. We've put together recommended resources for you. As you can see, and the full list will be shared with you in our follow-up email within 24 hours. You'll also see this links in the chat. These are the learning objectives from today's training, and we hope that you can now achieve them. We'll also share, again, an email with a list of our slides and resources in the next day. And before signing off, I hope that you'll take a very short moment to complete our feedback survey. This survey takes just less than a minute, and it's incredibly helpful for us in improving our trainings moving forward. We have seen the feedback you've given us, and we've hopefully incorporated, so we'd love to hear it. And depending on how you join this webinar, the survey itself might be already open in your browser. If not, please click on the link that Tanisha just put in the chat. And finally, here is Switchboard's contact information, and I do hope you'll stay in touch with us and join us for future trainings. Switchboard has over 1,000 resources that you can go in and find more information on any of the topics that we've talked about. Thank you again so much for joining today, and a huge thank you to my colleagues, Jess and Loanne. It's been a pleasure co-facilitating with you guys, and also our co-hosts Tanisha and Rebecca, who have been manning both the chat and the Q&A. With that, thank you and have a great day.
Thank you all. Take care.